Hello, I'm Owen Marin. I'm from 418 Greenfield, New York, and I'm working with the Veterans Breakfast Club to interview veterans as part of my Eagle project. Here I am with Anne, which we are not related as it seems, just share the last name. Um, but she is a veteran. And Anne, could you tell me a little bit about yourself and your service?
All right. Well, I'm 69 years old, born in 52. I joined the Army when I had just turned 21. I had already done 2 years of college and I wasn't sure what I wanted to major in. I took a year or so off and then I decided to join the Army so I could sort of figure out. I thought I might be interested in criminology, but I wasn't sure. So I wanted to try being in the MPs, and I also wanted to get the GI Bill so that I could go to a better school because I was going to San Diego State and it was too much of a party school, but that's all my parents were willing to pay for. So I wanted to go to UCSD, which was a better school. I was born and raised in San Diego. Um, and so then I joined. Actually, 1974 was the year that I joined, and it was the very beginning of the year. It was like the first week of February, and the regular Army they had abolished the draft. The year before was the last year of the draft, and so it had just gone to an all-volunteer Army. And also the Women's Army Corps had been abolished, and women for the first time were included in the regular Army. And so I was literally I was in the fifth basic training group for women. I was in Company E, which meant it goes A, B, C, D, E. So it was like the fifth week of the first, year that women were in the regular Army. So they didn't really know what they were doing with us. So they were experimenting, they were learning, how to handle women. So we were trained in the same location as the men, but they actually had an all women's training battalion. They weren't mixing the training yet for the sectors. So that's that.
So what was it like nowadays women are really generally accepted in the Army. What was it like being the first compared to now?
I felt like they were sort of handling us with kid gloves and they didn't really know what to do with us yet. So our training was way easier than the men's training. And we didn't have especially all the physical demands we did not have. And they had special classes for us like hair and makeup, things like that. They wanted us to be groomed in such a way that we would reflect well in the Army according to the standards of the time, it was still a very sexist society. It was in the early 70s, but to a certain extent, we're still living in the 50s. The culture was still very much post-war culture where women were relegated to, the kitchen and so forth.
When did you leave
So
the service?
it was very unusual. Huh?
When did you leave the
Go ahead.
service?
I was only in for 3 years. It really did not suit me. And I found out that being an MP, that being a cop didn't suit me either. I really didn't have the street smarts and the toughness to be a good cop. So I decided when I got out and I went back to college not to major in criminology, but to major in sociology, which is a related field, but more general.
What was your job as an MP?
I was just, the first year I was a patrol officer at Fort Lewis, Washington, which is a large base. And we just had regular, what we called garrison police, which was just like a regular police force. We drove regular patrol cars. And there were also field MPs, but who went out with they worked in the field with when people were training to go to war in the field, but we were strictly on base and doing on base activities. So just like traffic, responding to incidents, and gate guard duties. You know, there was housing. There was housing on post for military families. So, you know, we could respond to anything from a bar fight to a domestic dispute to a murder, you know, and just during regular traffic stops, you know, little accidents, handling accidents, you name it.
What was the most challenging part about that?
For me, the most frustrating part was that they were, like I said, they were handling us women with kid gloves, and we weren't really, they were protecting us. We weren't really allowed to go to any kind of an incident that they thought would be too stressful or dangerous or challenging for us. Like, for example, there was a murder and they found a body and had been buried, and I was the partner of the shift lieutenant that night, and he had to go to that incident obviously because he was in charge of the shift. So he actually dropped me off at the station and left me there because he said he didn't want me like freaking out and throwing up and stuff, and that I would just be more trouble than I was worth.
Do you have
And
any
maybe
other?
he was right. Maybe I would have thrown up, but you know, I
Do you
mean,
have
I
any other
just,
stories? Oh, I'm sorry. I think there's
it,
little.
it's just, I just felt like, you know, we weren't allowed to really, you know, thrive in the role. We were very protected.
Do you have any other hard days that you remember?
Yeah, there was a lot of sexual harassment and abuse, just in general, from both from officers and from fellow enlisted people. And also, we didn't have proper uniforms for the weather and so forth. We had to wear skirts and stockings when the men were wearing, you know, a wool uniform with 2 pairs of long johns under their pants, you know, and we were out there in the middle of the night in the dead of winter with inadequate clothing because they just didn't have proper uniforms for us for the job and for, you know, conditions.
Did you have any positive experiences?
Well, you know, I always make the best of it. So yeah, sure, there was positive experiences.
Would you do it
Like,
again?
no, no. I mean, I understand that I got, you know, the GI Bill, which is super important, but under the circumstances that things are now, I personally would never want to go into a war. I would never want to go into a war zone. And this was a peacetime army because it was just the end of the Vietnam era and we hadn't gotten into the terrorist era yet. So for practically the only time ever since World War II, we weren't involved in any kind of a war.
Do you recommend a woman joining now to join in the military?
From what I understand, the sexual harassment and abuse has not charged. Has not changed. They just cover it up. It's just systematically covered up. And so there's, in addition to all the other stresses of, you know, being in war and everything, women have to deal with that on top of everything else. So no, I really wouldn't recommend it. I mean, I wouldn't recommend that my sons go into the military now. I mean, because we're in a state of perpetual war. It's become, our whole economy has been based on war throughout my entire lifetime. And it's not changing. And, you know, people that are, you know, getting rich off of that, basically control the government through, you know, lobbying and donations and so forth. And both parties do it. Both parties perpetuate war. So no, I wouldn't.
You mentioned your two sons. Are they enlisted?
No, neither one of them ever went in the service, and I wouldn't. I always discouraged them from going in the service because by that time I was in my 30s when I had kids, and I could see how things were going. I could see that how corrupt our system is, and how I just don't believe in it anymore. I mean, back at the time when I joined, I was idealistic, I was patriotic, I was conservative, I was anti-communist. But after that, like in my 30s, I started to see how things really work and what's really going on. And it's all about capitalism.
Did you come from a military family at all?
My dad had been he had gone to the Merchant Marine Academy during World War II and has served in the Merchant Marine during World War II. And then he got out. And then during the Korean War, he went back in, this time into the Navy as an officer. But then he didn't stay in it. He was just in for the duration of the Korean War. And so he was not a lifer or anything. And so I was actually born during the Korean War, during the Truman era.
Are there any lessons you learned from the military that you haven't forgotten, still live by?
I learned to stand up for myself and to fight back. And I really didn't take any crap off of anybody. Like, I would raise holy hell if anybody, gave me a hard time or harassed me in any way. I would shake things up, and I didn't care if I got in trouble or not. And sometimes I did, but I just wasn't standing for any mistreatment. And unfortunately, most of the women were too timid to fight back, but I wasn't.
What do you think civilians can learn from veterans or active military service women?
Oh gosh. I can't speak for other service women, honestly, because, in my experience, I'm kind of unique, different. I'm much more analytical about things than most women are. And I don't know what they could learn from other women. I just know what they could learn from me.
Do you have any positive or negative stories you want to share?
Well, I kind of already gave you the negative stories in a nutshell. I'm not going to get into all the details because it's just, ugly. But positive stories. Well, the best thing that happened to me, when I was at Fort Lewis at the end of my first year there, I ended up going to the provost marshal, the post commander, to complain about all the harassment and abuse that was going on in our unit against the women. And so he ended up moving me to another base to protect me from reprisals. So I was sent up to a very small base up in Seattle, which had been a little old missile base that was now retired, but there was just a small group of MPs that were basically just guarding the base because there was a lot of a lot of military housing that for military families all over Seattle that was still there, and there was a PX and stuff. So there were things that we could do, but basically it was just guard duty. And it was beautiful up there. It was just the most beautiful place in Seattle, prime real estate. And it was on this point overlooking Puget Sound, and you had a 360-degree view of everything. And so that was I spent 6 months there. that was really beautiful and peaceful. And then I got sent to Germany, and the next year and a half I was in Germany, and I loved it. I fell madly in love with Germany, and I traveled all over Europe, and it was great. So I was there for 3 years, because after I actually got out of the service there after a year and a half, but I stayed another year and a half because I didn't want to leave, because I loved it so much. So I worked as a civilian for the Army on one of the bases. And that was wonderful. That was one of the most wonderful experiences of my life.
What was your life like after?
After, so I came home to San Diego, and almost immediately after, well, I was looking for a roommate, and my future husband was just like advertising. He was renting a house, and he wanted to rent out one of the rooms. He was already renting out the other room. So I went to answer his ad, and I didn't move in, but we started dating, and, we ended up getting married 3.5 years later. And so that's what happened.
I can listen to more stories if you'd like. I mean, it is interesting to hear from you.
Okay, well, do you have any questions? I can get into more details about something if you want me to.
I don't have any more questions really. So you could just, I don't know, say what you want.
Let's see. I don't know. The day I got out of the Army, I was so happy just to turn in all my field gear, because they made us go to the field sometimes just in case there was a war. Because again, in Germany, I was just doing garrison duty. Basically, we were in Germany, the base system is different. They basically, when World War II was over, they took over all the German bases and put all of our people on their bases, and the Germans weren't allowed to have an army. So we were the only people that were protecting Germany from, any possible enemies. And also the Americans had a sector, the French had a sector, and the British had a sector. So the American sector was basically southern Germany. It was Bavaria and Baden-Württemberg. Baden-Württemberg is southwest Germany, and it's right on the Swiss border on one side and the French border on the other side. And so I was in Baden-Württemberg, and the city I was in was Stuttgart, and it's a major city. So around Stuttgart, the Germans had about 17 small posts, which is their system is different than ours. Instead of having great big posts that are farther away from each other, they would have very small little posts scattered around all over the place, just mixed in with, civilian neighborhoods. And so there were 17 posts around the greater Stuttgart area. So our job entailed driving from one to another. And so basically we were just cruising all around the greater Stuttgart area all the time. So, yeah, that's about it. And then I was living, when I got there, I was living off post, like most of the people were living in the barracks, but I was living off post because I got into a marriage of convenience, which basically means, we just wanted, and it was pretty common for people to do it at the time. We just wanted to get off post. So you'd get married just so that you could get, off base housing. So I was actually living in a nearby town, just in a regular German neighborhood. So I was basically immersed in German culture, and I was studying the language. And most Americans didn't do any of this stuff. Most Americans did not study German. They did not get out and, explore very much. They did not hang out with Germans. They just stayed in their little American enclave and, in their comfort zone. but I was adventurous and I like to explore. So I was different. And that marriage really obviously didn't last very long because it was just a marriage of convenience. So he basically had other girlfriends. I had other boyfriends, and it was just, in name only. And my sister came and lived with us for a while. She was studying German in college, and so she came and lived with us for about 6 months. And then later on, one of his girlfriends moved in with us. So it was just, it was just like roommates. So it was great. I had a really good time. I got a Mercedes Benz. I got a 5-year-old 280 SE for like $2,000. I think I paid for it. It was 75 and it was a 1970. So it was in really good condition. And that was a blast. That was the best car I ever had. It was a blast getting on the Autobahn and just, you could drive as fast as you wanted. And I drove all over Germany. And I went to France. I went to
When was the last time you visited Germany?
I wasn't able to go back until the second time I went back was in 2011. In the meantime, my husband and I had too much going on in our lives. We were having kids, we were both working, and we didn't have the money or the freedom to really travel to Europe again. I mean, I wanted to, but I tried to talk him into moving to Germany, but he didn't want to. So, so we went back in 2011. That was the first time he'd ever been there. And we were there for a month, and that was a really good trip. And I've only been back, then he died, unfortunately. My husband died almost 7 years ago. He was only 62. He died really young. But he had a bad illness. He had rheumatoid arthritis. So he died of complications from that. And so then I went back one more time by myself. And I also spent a month there. But it's not the same. I was alone and I was lonely. It's not the same traveling by yourself.
I'm sorry I cut you off earlier, but I heard France. What was that like?
Oh, yeah. I went to France. I went to Switzerland. I went to the Netherlands. I went to Greece. And I went to Berlin, which at the time was a separate country. East Germany was a separate country. And in order to get to Berlin, I also went to Austria. I went to England. And at the time to get to Berlin, you had to actually take a train from the West that didn't stop at all in between the West and Berlin. And when you got to Berlin, you were only allowed to stay in West Berlin. You could not go outside West Berlin. So that was really interesting. And that was when they had Checkpoint Charlie, if you remember hearing about that. Have you ever heard of that?
No, I have not.
It was like, yeah, okay. It was like the place where where East Berlin was separated from West Berlin, and there was like a no man's land. It was like the stretch of road, and on the west side was the American guard gate, and on the east side was the Russian guard gate, because Russia controlled Eastern Germany, and so there was this no man's land in between, and so you could stand. Checkpoint Charlie was the American side, the gate at the American side, so you could walk up to Checkpoint Charlie. And you could look over into no man's land. And you could see the Russians down there, or the East Germans, which is the same thing. They basically worked for the Russians. And that was interesting. Berlin's a great city, but it was very claustrophobic at the time because nobody could leave. All the West Berliners had to stay there too. They couldn't go anywhere. They couldn't go out into the countryside, So it was like living on a little island.
Did you make any friends in the service you're still in contact with today?
No, I don't. I made some friends, but nobody that I've stayed in contact with.
Was there a lot
So,
of camaraderie between women in the military, knowing that the harsh environment they were in?
um, you know, it was strange because I think all the women in my company would just kind of pair up with a guy. They would pair up with a guy that would be like their protector. And and of course all the guys had all different attitudes about things. So it felt like they were all very much under the thumb of their boyfriends in a way. Or some of them got married, but I just felt like the women were timid, and it was such an intimidating environment that we were not welcome. We were treated like the other. And, they didn't really want us there. They didn't want us for partners. They didn't feel like they could rely on us because they had this image of us as women that we were like, useless and helpless and we didn't belong there. And so it was, you know, it was, it kind of resulted in the atomization of our ability to, there, feminism was not well enough established in our culture yet that, there was any kind of sense of sisterhood or anything. It was still, feminism was still a pretty new thing.
I don't have any more questions, so unless you'd like to
Okay.
move on. If not, thank you so much for your service. It seems you struggled a lot. It's
I
this
was a
was
groundbreaker.
yeah.
So I was breaking ground for the women that came after me, and I fought the good fight. I did what I could, and I managed to survive. So, and I'm here to talk about it. So, yay.
Thank you so much.